This is the first in a series of tutorials covering Adobe Flash. Flash is primarily a piece of software used for making animations, and it's the next piece of software that we'll be covering in the class. We're looking at Adobe's work area right now, and similar to Photoshop, at the top you'll have a menu bar. Your most basic level of functionality is going to be found in the menu bar. So for example, under the File menu, you can open a new file, you can open an existing file, you can save a file, you can import and export, and you can publish the movie that you're working on. Under the Edit menu, you can cut and copy, you can duplicate things, etc. One of the most useful menus is the Window menu. The Window menu controls all of your palettes. Palettes are areas where you can get additional information on tools or additional settings for tools. Similar to Photoshop, underneath the Window menu, you have all of your palettes listed. The palettes that are currently open are the palettes that have a check box or a check mark by them. The palettes that don't have a check mark aren't currently open. So anytime you want to find a palette, for example, your library palette, which is one of the most commonly used palettes in Flash, you can come to the Window menu and then just choose it from the list. Incidentally, similar to Photoshop, if the palette has a shortcut, it'll be listed in the menu. For example, the library shortcut is Command L. So we're just going to choose that option, and that's going to open up the library. And if I click this tab that says Properties, that will bring up the Property palette. The Property palette is one of the most used palettes in Flash, and as the name suggests, it gives you properties about tools or objects or the work area itself. So right now I don't have any objects selected, and so the information that the property palette is displaying is the information that controls the work area itself. So for example, the work area by default is white, and if I wanted to change that, I could come down here to where it says Stage, and I could click and set that to any color that I wanted to. You can also change the size of the stage. So I set that to gray, so let's go and set that back to white. So just above where it says Stage, you have a size setting, and by default it defaults to 550 by 400. But let's say I wanted to edit that. I could hit the Edit button, which would open up my Document Settings dialog box, and I could change the dimensions. So for example, if I wanted a square animation, I could set the dimensions to 500 pixels by 500 pixels. It's important to note that you should do this at the beginning of your animation. If you're midway through an animation and you decide you want to change the size of your stage, it's not going to change the size of the objects that you've already placed in the animation. It's only going to change the work area, which potentially will crop things and can kind of be disastrous. So you want to make sure you do this from the beginning. If you hit OK, you can see that now my work area is a perfect square instead of the default rectilinear work area. I'm going to go ahead and hit Command Z, and that's going to undo the last thing that I did. So it's going to return my work area to the rectangle that it defaults to. Similar to Photoshop and other graphic software, you're also going to have a toolbar. So my toolbar is located on the left. Yours may be located in a different direction, a different location, because the toolbar is simply a very specialized palette, and like all palettes, it can be moved around. So you can click it and you can move it to a different location. I'm going to keep it in one long line of tools and refer to the tools as Tool 1, Tool 2, Tool 3, etc. Similar to Photoshop's toolbar, Flash's toolbar gives you your tool functionality. So for example, you have your Move tool, which is the first tool. The second tool is your Subselection tool. The third tool is your Free Transform tool, etc. Also notice that if you put your cursor over a tool and you just let it sit there for a second, a dialog box will pop up which will tell you the name of the tool, and it'll also give you the tool shortcut. So for example, this tool is the Subselection tool, and the shortcut is A on your keyboard. That brings us to the work area itself. So the work area itself is a little different than, say, Photoshop's work area. You have two parts in the work area. You have a white part and a gray part. The best way to think about the work area is in terms of an analogy of a stage. So the wide area of the work area is going to be where you put your actors, if you will, or the parts of your animation. And anything that's in the wide area is going to be viewed in your final animation. The gray part of the work area you can think of as the wings of the stage. So this is where you set stuff up. So let's say you have a character that you're about to bring across the stage, but you don't want it to be viewed in the animation yet. Well, you can put it in any of this gray area, and it will not be viewed in the animation until you bring it into the wide area. The area in Flash that is significantly different than, say, Photoshop is this area at the bottom that's called the timeline. So obviously, Flash is primarily meant for making animations, so you need some way to control time. So in the timeline, you have frames, starting with frame 1 and going forward in time, and basically that represents time, but it doesn't represent seconds. If you come back over to your property palette, which we were talking about earlier, when I don't have anything selected and I click on the main stage, it'll give me the properties for the main stage. And right here where it says FPS, that stands for frames per second, and it defaults to 24. Let's change that to 10. So now these numbers that are in my timeline represent seconds, or 1 second, in tenths. So at 10 here, that's 1 second in time. At 20 would be 2 seconds in time. 25 would be 2.5 seconds in time. 30 would be 3 seconds in time, etc. You can also change your frames per second in this area at the bottom of the timeline, which shows you your frame rate. Next to that area, it shows you how long your existing animation is, and at this point, because we haven't done anything, our animation is set to 0.0. The next thing that I want to talk about is the basic drawing tools in Flash. If you're familiar with Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop or other Adobe products, the drawing tools in Flash are going to be the same in some ways, but significantly different in other ways. At first this might be daunting, but eventually as you get used to the tools, you'll find that they have advantages for animation. So I'm going to start with the rectilinear tool. Now incidentally, like Photoshop, in the toolbar, if there's a little triangle in the bottom right hand corner of a tool, that's letting you know that there's a flyout and there are additional tools available. So in the case of the rectangle tool, there's also an oval tool, a rectangle primitive tool, an oval primitive tool, and a poly star tool for making polygons and stars. I'm not going to talk about all those today, but we're going to start by talking about the rectangle tool. Now the rectangle tool works in conjunction with the colors that you have set at the bottom of your toolbar. I'm just going to pull this work area down further so you can see that. Let me pull my toolbar down. So at the very bottom of the toolbar, you have these two little color chips. The top one has a pencil next to it, which sets the color for your stroke, and the bottom one has a paint bucket next to it, which sets your fill color. So if I draw a rectangle, it's going to draw this rectangle with an orange fill color and a red stroke. Now the stroke is really small, so I don't know if y'all can see that. But if I select this rectangle by getting the direct selection tool, or the main selection tool, which is the first tool, I can click and pull, and anything that is inside that box will be selected. So it will select the rectangle, including the stroke and the fill. Whenever you have something selected and it's a primitive graphic, which we'll talk more about that later, Flash lets you know that it's selected by putting this kind of gridded dot pattern on the object. So now with that rectangle selected, if you look in my property palette is no longer giving me information about the stage, but is giving me information specific to that object. If I go to where it says stroke, I can increase the size of the stroke on this object by pulling the slider to the right. So I'm going to make this thicker, so that's at 12.5, just so that you can see that it is the case that the stroke is red and the fill is orange. If you want to change the fill or stroke, I could either change it in the toolbar or I could change it in the property palette. So for example, I could click on the fill color chip, which would bring up my color picker, and I could change it to blue. Or I can click on the stroke color chip. That will also bring up the color picker, and I could change the stroke to say green. Let's talk a little bit about selecting objects in Flash. It's a little different than what you're used to if you're familiar with Adobe Illustrator or Photoshop. In Flash, it will let you select an object in its pieces. So if I want to select just the fill of this rectangle, I could single click on the fill. The fill will become highlighted with that grid pattern that lets me know it's selected. And if I drag the fill, it will separate the fill from the stroke. I'm going to Command Z that to undo. If I single click on the stroke, it will select that segment of the stroke. And if I click and drag, it will separate that piece of the stroke from the rest of the border. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. If I double click a stroke, it will select all the segments of the stroke. And if I click and drag, I can separate the entire rectangle stroke from the rectangle's fill. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. If I double click a fill, it selects both the stroke and the fill, and I can move the object without separating its parts. Now initially that's a little bit tricky to get used to, especially if you're familiar with other software, but it's really convenient in terms of taking something into its pieces really quickly. So it's an efficient way to work. You can also do this. Let's say that I only want half of both the fill and the stroke. I can get the selection tool and click and drag a box, and anything that's included in that box becomes selected. So notice that the left-hand side of both the fill and the stroke is selected, but the right-hand side isn't, as delineated by the dotted grid pattern. And if I drag, it will cut the object in two. So you can quickly take something into pieces in Flash. It's a very efficient way to work. I'm going to Command Z to undo that. Let's say that I wanted to delete an object. Well, I can select the object using one of the methods that I just went over. I'm going to box select it. And then if you just hit delete on your keyboard, it'll delete the object. Let's move on to the paintbrush tool, which is two tools underneath the rectangle tool. Now the paintbrush tool also has another tool on its flyout, the spray brush tool. I'm not going to talk about that today. The paintbrush tool works in conjunction with your color chips, and it also works in conjunction with this area at the very bottom of the toolbar. Notice that that area will change, and there'll be a few different options that are constantly changing down here depending upon what tool I have selected. So if I select the Move tool, I have this little snap to function, right? And this looks different than if I select the paintbrush tool. When I have the paintbrush tool selected, the options that I have, let's start at the bottom, I have different brush sizes, different brush shapes, right? So a circular shape, an oval shape, a square shape, a rectilinear shape, a calligraphy brush. Above that, I have different brush sizes. So I'm going to switch to one of the bigger brushes, or let's say the biggest brush. And I'm going to draw something. So just draw a circle. Now notice that it's using blue because that's the fill color that I have selected. Also notice that it kind of smooths out the object as I draw it. So if I draw a square and my hand's a little shaky, Flash will, to some degree, straighten out my lines. That's controlled in the property palette. Now notice that my property palette is now set to the brush properties because I have the brush tool selected. And if you go down to the smoothing function, I can set that all the way to 100, which is its highest setting. And now if I draw a shape, I'll get the greatest amount of smoothing. So it will make that much closer to a geometric circle, or much closer to a geometric square. If I don't want smoothing at all and I want it to look exactly how I draw it, with all the shakes and bumps and everything, then set your smoothing to 0, and then if my hand bumps, it doesn't smooth it at all. It ends up looking exactly as squiggly as it is when I initially draw it. Let me select these objects by box selecting them with the selection tool, and I'm going to hit delete on my keyboard. A couple of other interesting functions in terms of drawing in Flash. I'm going to get the rectangle selection tool, the rectangle drawing tool, and I'm going to hold Shift. Similar to Photoshop, if you hold Shift, it will constrain your shape. So in this case, it'll make it a perfect square. Or if I switch to the oval tool, and I'll hold Shift while I'm drawing an oval, it will constrain it to a perfect circle. So Shift is your constraint tool, and that's similar to Photoshop. Now let me change my paint color. Now I'm going to deselect first. To deselect something, let me change that back, so I just did a Command Z. To deselect something, while it's selected, just simply click in the empty part of your work area, and it will deselect the current thing that you have selected. So I'm going to go and change my fill color to a red, and I'm going to get my paintbrush, and you have this other area that controls your brush mode that I'm pointing to. Again, it's at the bottom of your toolbar in that option area that's constantly changing depending upon what tool you have. So in this case, this is the brush tool options. The brush mode controls how your brush interacts with objects that are already on the page. So by default, it's going to be in normal mode. But if you look at your options, you have paint normal, paint fill, paint behind, paint selection, and paint inside. So let's switch that to the paint fill option, and it's going to behave a little differently. So now if I paint with my brush, and I'm just going to paint across these objects that I've already made, at first it'll look as though it's painting everywhere, but when I release the mouse, it's not going to paint in the areas that have strokes. It's only going to paint in areas that don't have strokes. And so that's a real quick way to, say, make a drop shadow on a character's face without having to be too careful about it. Now we'll talk more about how that's beneficial to animation. So I'm gonna leave that discussion for another day. But everywhere I paint with the brush, it automatically makes an object out of that painted area. So I end up with objects that were outside of the box and objects that were inside the box. Also notice that if you paint over a primitive, right, or you make a shape over a primitive, it deletes the pixels that were previously there. So in this case, it deleted the blue pixels and replaced them with red pixels. So let me clean this up. And I'm going to make another shape. And let's change our paint color. I'll change it to blue. You also have the option of painting behind. So what painting behind does is it doesn't paint on top, it only paints behind the current object. And so that's useful if you had a character's head and you wanted to paint, something like clouds or foliage or something that's in the background without interfering with the character. You don't even have to be careful. You can just quickly paint and it will only paint behind if you have that particular option set. Now I'm going to undo that, Command Z. The next option for the paintbrush is paint selection. So with this option, you first have to have something selected. So if I select the fill and I have my paintbrush set to paint selection, then it's only going to paint what I currently have selected. So in that case, it only painted on the red fill. Let's undo that. You could even have just part of the fill selected, and then if I painted selection, it would paint on the part that's selected, but not the part that's not selected. Command Z. The last option is paint inside, and what paint inside does is it starts painting where you click. So I'm going to click inside the red area, and it samples those pixels, and then it only paints pixels that are similar. So even though I can go outside, it won't paint outside, it'll only paint inside. The one thing that can be frustrating about those painting options is if you forget to put it back to normal and you want the brush to behave normal. So even if you don't use those options in the beginning, you want to know that they're available. So if you're getting weird results when you're trying to paint, you can go and set that back to normal. The next option I'm going to talk about in terms of Flash's painting tools is this little area that's called the object drawing box or tool. Initially we won't be using that, but eventually we will get to discussion of what that's useful for. But you need to know that it exists because, again, if it's pushed in and it's active, your tool will behave in a way that's unexpected. So when that's pushed in, it'll be kind of gray and we'll be in object drawing mode. And so now if I draw, let's say I draw with the paintbrush, Flash will automatically put a box around that, which is the visual cue to let you know that that's a symbol. And we're going to talk more about symbols, but if that's not what you expect, it'll behave in a weird way. And so you need to know that this option is available so you can make sure it's turned off initially. If I turn that option off and I draw, notice the difference. Right? If I select the top one, it's got this blue bounding box around it that lets me know that that's a symbol. And if I select the bottom one, it has this kind of dot pattern on it, which lets me know that that's a primitive. That's important because primitives are the most base level of Flash, and they're the level that is editable. This symbol is also editable, but you have to edit it in a very specific way, which we're not going to cover right now. And if you don't know how to do that, it'll be frustrating to you to try to edit this. So until we talk about it further, while you're drawing in Flash, make sure to double check that this object drawing is turned off. And if you don't intend to use one of these different paint modes, then double check to make sure your paint mode is set to normal. So that covers the basics of Flash's work area. It also covers the basics of Flash's drawing tools. So that's all we're going to cover for today. That should get you started.